"I'll buy the obese widow for $1. That's what the giant cowboy shouted in the middle of the auction yard, and it stopped every voice cold. The snow was falling, the crowd was jeering, and she was about to be sold like a mule to settle her dead husband's debts. No one knew why a man that big, that quiet, would step forward for a woman the town had already laughed out of its heart. But the moment his silver dollar hit the block, the air changed. He wasn't buying a wife. At least, that's what he claimed. Out in the high country shack, with the wind pressing against the walls, she would discover a locked chest and a paper inside tying her name to his, in a way no preacher or judge could undo. Now the cattle baron wants her spring, the railroad men want her gone, and someone out there is willing to burn the cabin to the ground to make it happen. Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The icy wind cut through Clara Mae Patterson's thin black dress as she stood on the auction block, her shoulders squared, despite the humiliation burning in her chest. The December morning in Silverton had drawn a crowd that pressed close to the wooden platform, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Snow whipped sideways across the main street, dusting the shoulders of men who'd come to witness her. "Shame. Next up, folks," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying over the whistling wind. "The widow Patterson herself." He gestured toward Clara with an exaggerated flourish. "Comes with basic cooking skills and enough girth to keep you warm through winter." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Clara's fingers dug into her palms, but she kept her chin high. The debtor's auction of her late husband's estate had already seen their furniture, tools, and even her mother's cherished china sold off piece by piece. Now she stood as the final item, legally bound to work off James Patterson's gambling debts. The auctioneer's words cut deeper than the cold. "Who'll start the bidding? She may take up extra space in your wagon, but think of the cooking." "More." Cruel laughter followed as snow collected on Clara's shoulders. Through tear-blurred eyes, she spotted Morton, the saloon owner, shouldering his way forward. His meaty hand rose, and Clara's stomach clenched. She'd heard whispers about how he treated the women who worked for him. Just then, the crowd shifted and parted. A massive figure pushed through. Eli Cartwright, ducking his head to keep his hat from catching on the awnings that lined the street. At 6 feet 6 inches, he towered over everyone else. Clara had seen him around town but never spoken to. Him, most folks hadn't. He kept to himself, hauling timber and breaking horses, showing up in Silverton only when necessary. The auctioneer's smile faltered as Eli's heavy boots thudded onto the platform. Without ceremony, he reached into his coat and pulled out a silver dollar. The coin flashed in the weak winter light as it spun across the wooden block. "I'll buy the obese widow for $1. Eli's deep voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent street. Clara's chin trembled, but whether from cold or emotion, she couldn't tell. The crowd's mocking laughter had died completely, replaced by uncertain murmurs. They all knew Eli's reputation, not just his size, but the stories about why he'd left the Buffalo Soldiers, refusing orders that would have harmed innocent Apache women and children. The auctioneer cleared his throat, glancing between Morton's scowl and Eli's impassive face. "Now see here. The minimum bid was set at $1, Eli stated flatly. "I've met it." His massive hand rested near the coin. Fingers splayed across the wood. More whispers rippled through the crowd. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the auctioneer's internal struggle play across his face. Finally, he lifted his gavel. $1 bid. "Do I hear two?" His voice cracked slightly as he looked toward Morton. The saloon owner's face had turned an ugly shade of red, but he kept his hand down. No one else spoke up. "Going once... The auctioneer's voice wavered. "Going twice... The wind howled down. The street. Sold to Mr. Cartwright for $1. The gavel's crack echoed off the false fronts of the buildings. Clara jumped at the sound, her legs unsteady after standing so long in the cold. Before she could stumble, Ella's enormous hand appeared before her, palm up in silent offer. He tipped his hat with his other hand, treating her with a formal courtesy that had been absent from the entire morning. "Ma'am?" Clara hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. His fingers were warm and calloused as they closed gently around hers. With surprising grace for such a large man, he helped her step down from the platform. The crowd parted wider as Eli guided her toward a wagon waiting at the edge of the street. His body blocked most of the wind, and Clara found herself walking a little straighter. Their boots crunched through the fresh snow, the sound muffled and somehow intimate in the strange hush that had fallen over the town. No one spoke as Eli helped her up onto the wagon seat. He tucked a heavy buffalo robe around her before climbing up himself. The wooden seat creaked under his weight as he settled beside her and took up the reins. Clara kept her eyes forward as Eli clucked to the horses. She could feel the stares of the townspeople boring into her back as the wagon pulled away from the auction block. The snow was falling harder now, already beginning to erase their tracks from the street. Only when they'd passed the last building did Clara realize she was shaking. Whether from cold, relief, or terror at what her future might hold, she wasn't sure. She'd just been purchased for $1 by a man she'd never spoken to, a giant of a man who lived alone in the hills and rarely came to town. The wagon wheels crunched through the snow, and the wind carried away any words she might have. Sighed. Clara pulled the buffalo robe tighter around her shoulders and watched her past disappear into the swirling white behind them. The wagon wheels creaked through deepening snow as they left Silverton behind. Clara May Patterson sat rigid beside Eli Cartwright, her worn carpetbag clutched tightly in her lap. It held everything she now owned in the world: 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, and a few precious photographs wrapped in cloth. The wind whipped loose strands of hair around her face as she stole glances at the giant of a man beside her. His huge hands held the reins loosely, guiding the horses through drifts that grew higher with each passing mile. Neither had spoken since leaving town. Clara cleared her throat. "Mr. Cartwright, Eli," he interrupted softly, his deep voice barely carrying over the whistle of the wind. "Just Eli is fine, ma'am," she nodded, clutching her bag tighter. "Where exactly are we headed?" "Got a line shack up in Timber Creek Valley. It ain't much, but it's warm and dry." He paused, eyes on the trail ahead. "Thought maybe we could help each other out. I need someone to cook and mend while I'm working. You need somewhere safe for the winter." Before Clara could respond, the wind suddenly shifted, bringing a wall of white that nearly obscured the trail. The horses nickered nervously as snow pelted their faces. "There's shelter ahead," Eli said, squinting through the squall. "Best wait it out." He guided the team off the trail toward a rocky bluff where several tall pines offered protection from the wind. Once the wagon was positioned under the natural shelter, Eli jumped down and began unhitching the horses. Clara watched him work, noting how his massive hands moved with surprising gentleness as he tended to the animals. A long scar traced down his left cheek, silver white against his weather-darkened skin. His coat had been patched multiple times, the stitching neat but visible. Yet there was something about his eyes, steady and kind, that eased some of the tension in her shoulders. "Let me help," she offered, starting to climb down. "Stay put, ma'am. You'll just get soaked." He finished with the horses and climbed back onto the wagon seat, bringing with him the scent of pine and snow. "Won't last long. These squalls blow through quick." They sat in silence as the storm raged around their shelter. Clara found herself studying his profile, trying to reconcile this quiet giant with the stories she'd heard about him in town, about his time with the Buffalo Soldiers, About why he'd left them. As if sensing her thoughts, Eli spoke. Reckon you're wondering why. I did what I did back there. Yes, she admitted, though I'm grateful for it. He nodded slowly. Ain't right, treating folks that way. Making sport of their troubles. His jaw tightened. Seen enough of that in my time. The storm began to ease, and soon they were back on the trail. The afternoon light was fading when Eli finally pointed ahead. There it is. Clara peered through the gathering dusk at a modest log cabin, its roof half buried in snow. Smoke from an old storm must have drifted against the bluff behind it, creating the deep drifts. A small barn stood off to one side, its door secured against the weather. Eli helped her down from the wagon, then led the horses to the barn while Clara stood uncertainly by the cabin door. When he returned, he brushed past her to unlock it, ducking his head to enter. It ain't much, he repeated, moving to the cold fireplace. But it's solid. Clara stepped inside, taking in the sparse furnishings. A narrow bed against one wall, a small table with 2 chairs, and a locked chest in the corner. While Eli built up the fire, she unpacked her few belongings, arranging them carefully in the single drawer he'd cleared for her use. The fire caught quickly, sending welcome warmth through the single room. Clara found dried beans and cornmeal in the small pantry, and soon had supper cooking on the restored hearth. Her eyes kept straying to the locked chest, but she didn't ask. Some questions were better left for later. They ate their simple meal of beans and cornbread in comfortable silence. The fire popped and crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Outside, the wind had picked up again, driving snow against the single window. I'll sleep on the floor, Eli said as they finished eating. You take the bed. Clara started to protest, but he was already unrolling a blanket near the hearth. She watched as he arranged his huge frame on the wooden floor, wondering how he could possibly be comfortable. Thank you, she said softly, settling onto the bed. For everything today. He nodded without looking up. Get some rest, Mrs. Patterson. Been a long day. Clara, she corrected. Just Clara is fine. A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he echoed her earlier lesson. Clara, then. She pulled the quilt up to her chin, listening to the storm howl outside. The fire's warmth and the day's emotional exhaustion soon pulled her toward sleep. Her last conscious thought was that while she might have been bought for $1, she felt oddly safe in this small cabin with its giant occupant. Through the night, the storm raged on, sealing them in with drifts of snow against the door. But inside, the fire burned steady, and 2 people who'd started the day as strangers found peaceful rest, one on a narrow bed, the other on the hard floor, both far from the cruel laughter of the morning's auction block. Morning brought a pristine stillness to the snow-covered valley. The storm had passed, leaving behind drifts that sparkled like diamond dust in the early light. Clara woke to the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood. Through the cabin's frosted window, she could see Eli's tall form working steadily at the woodpile, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. She dressed quickly in the lingering warmth of the banked fire, grateful for the thick wool stockings she'd managed to save from the auction. The cabin floor felt solid beneath her feet as she moved about, adding wood to the coals and setting water to heat for coffee, while the pot burbled on the cookstove. Clara's hands itched to bring order to the bachelor's cabin. Eli kept things tidy enough, but she could see places where a woman's touch was sorely needed. Dust had settled into corners, and the curtains, if you could call the faded fabric squares hanging at the windows curtains, hadn't seen soap in years. Her gaze kept returning to the wooden chest tucked against the far wall. It wasn't particularly fancy, just a solid box of dark wood with iron hinges. The key hung on a peg nearby, its iron length catching glints of morning light. Clara's fingers twitched toward it, but she pulled them back. Whatever secrets that chest held weren't hers to uncover, at least not without permission. Instead, She turned her attention to the small pantry. Behind some dry goods, she discovered a cache of dried venison, the meat dark and well-preserved. Perfect for a hearty stew. Soon the cabin filled with the rich aroma of meat, potatoes, and herbs as she worked, humming softly to herself the way she used to when cooking for her father's ranch hands. The short winter day was fading into dusk. When Eli finally came in, stamping snow from his boots, he filled the doorway like a bear in winter clothes, bringing with him a blast of cold air and the sharp scent of pine. "Something smells mighty fine," he said, hanging his coat on a peg. His eyes took in the swept floor and organized shelves. "Place looks different." Clara ladled stew into 2 bowls, pleased at how the venison had turned tender. "Found some meat in the pantry. Hope you don't mind." "Mind? Been living on beans and coffee so long, I nearly forgot what real cooking tastes like." He settled his large frame carefully onto one of the wooden chairs, which creaked in protest. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Clara found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the way his massive hands somehow managed to handle the spoon delicately, how his shoulders seemed to carry some invisible weight. Finally, she couldn't contain her curiosity any longer. The chest had been drawing her eyes all day like a magnet. "Mr. Cartwright, Eli, what's in that chest? If you don't mind my asking." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set down his spoon and stood, moving to retrieve the key from its peg. "Reckon you have a right to know. Been trying to figure out how to tell you since yesterday." Clara's heart picked up speed as he unlocked the chest. The hinges creaked as he lifted the lid, removing something wrapped carefully in oilcloth. His hands were steady, but his face had gone grave as he unwrapped the package and handed her a single sheet of paper. It was a marriage certificate, the kind used in proxy marriages when one party couldn't be present. Clara's eyes widened as she read the names, hers and Eli's, dated 5 years earlier. The document bore official seals, but where her signature should have been, there was only a blank space. "I don't understand," she whispered, though a horrible suspicion was dawning. "I never signed this." Ayla sat heavily in his chair. "Your husband did. He was in trouble, needed water rights for his cattle. That spring on your father's land, the one you inherited, he wanted access. Came to me with a deal. Said he'd arrange things so I'd have legal claim to the spring after he was gone." Clara's hands began to shake. He had no right. "No, ma'am, he didn't. But he was desperate. Signed your name to a proxy marriage contract with me, then had it filed at the county seat. I didn't know until after, thought it was all above board." Eli's voice carried years of regret. "By the time I found out the truth, the document was legal and binding. Never been annulled." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Clara stared at the paper, memories of her late husband taking on new, darker shapes. How many other secrets had he kept? How many other deals had he made with her life as the bargaining chip? So according to this ... She couldn't finish the thought. "According to the law, you've been my wife these past 5 years," Eli confirmed quietly. "Though I never tried to claim it. Wasn't right, how it was done." Clara stood abruptly, needing to move. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too close. She pressed her hands against the rough-hewn windowsill, staring out at the moonlit snow. Her breath fogged the glass as questions tumbled through her mind. "Is that why you came to the auction?" she asked finally. "Because of this paper?" "Partly," Eli admitted. "Couldn't stand by and watch them treat you that way. But also because ... quotes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Because I figured you ought to know the truth. Have a say in what happens next." Clara turned back to face him. "What happens next?" she repeated softly. "What exactly does that mean for my freedom?" Eli met her gaze steadily. "Means whatever you want it to mean. That paper might say we're married, but I ain't the kind of man to hold you to something you never chose." You're free to go whenever you please." The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, a night bird called into the darkness. Clara looked down at the certificate still clutched in her hands, a document that had shaped her life without her knowledge for 5 years. Yet here was Eli, offering her choice where her late husband had given her none. The question of what to do with this newfound knowledge hung in the air between them, heavy as the snow outside. Dawn crept through the frost-laced windows as Clara eased from beneath her quilt. The cabin's air held the sharp bite of a winter morning, but the banked coals in the stove still glowed red. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake Eli from his bedroll near the hearth. Her hands knew the familiar rhythm of biscuit making, even in this unfamiliar kitchen. Measuring flour into a bowl helped steady her racing thoughts about last night's revelation. The marriage certificate felt like a weight in the cabin, even locked away in its chest again. "Baking helps me think straight," she murmured to herself, working cold butter into the flour with practiced fingers. The dough came together, smooth and proper under her hands. Outside, she heard Eli's heavy footsteps crunching through the snow toward the lean-to stable. The horses nickered their morning greetings. Through the window, she watched his tall form move between tasks, feeding, watering, checking hooves. He worked with quiet efficiency, as if trying to lose himself in routine, just as she was by. The time he came in, stamping snow from his boots, fresh biscuits sat golden brown on the table alongside a pot of coffee. Steam rose from both in the cold air. "Much obliged," he said softly, settling his large frame carefully onto a chair that creaked beneath him. Neither mentioned the certificate as they ate, though Clara could feel its presence like another person in the room. Finally, Eli cleared his throat. "That spring you inherited from your father, have you seen it?" Clara shook her head. "Never did get out there. After Jonathan died, I moved into town. Seemed easier than trying to work the land alone." She paused, buttering another biscuit. "Though I reckon that was a mistake now." "It's good water," Eli said. "Sweet and clear, runs strong even in drought. Railroad's been eyeing it for their steam engines. Local ranchers want it too. Water rights mean everything out here. Is that why Jonathan," she couldn't finish the question, "why he arranged that proxy marriage?" "Partly. Water was getting scarce even then. He thought having legal claim to that spring would save his herd." Eli's voice held no judgment, just quiet. Understanding. Clara was about to respond when hoofbeats approached through the snow. Both turned toward the window as a rider appeared, young Thomas Avery, from the telegraph office, his horse's breath steaming in the cold air. "Miss Patterson, Mr. Cartwright," Thomas called out, dismounting awkwardly in the deep snow. His cheeks were red from the cold ride. Eli opened the door, filling the frame. "Come in, boy. Get warm a minute." Thomas stumbled in, clutching a yellow telegram slip. "This came from Miss Patterson early this morning. Agent said it was urgent." Clara accepted the paper with trembling fingers. Eli moved closer, his presence solid and reassuring at her shoulder as she unfolded it. "Would you read it?" she asked him softly. "My eyes ain't what they used to be." In truth, her hands were shaking too much to focus on the words. Eli took the telegram, his deep voice filling the cabin. "To MRS. Clara Patterson, stop generous offer for water rights. To spring on inherited land. Stop $5,000 cash immediate payment. Stop reply soon. Stop signed James Marshall, Western Railroad agent." Clara's breath caught. $5,000 was more money than she'd ever seen. It could buy comfort, security, a fresh start somewhere else. For a moment, the temptation pulled at her like a physical force. Then she remembered her father's face the day he'd shown her that spring, his weathered hand gesturing to the clear water bubbling from the earth. "This here's life itself, Clara. May," he'd said, "don't never let nobody take it from you." "No," she said firmly, squaring her shoulders. "Tell them no, Thomas." "But Miss Patterson," Thomas shifted nervously, Mr. Marshall said he'd be coming out personally to discuss terms. Said it would be in your best interest to consider carefully. Something in his tone made Clara's spine stiffen. Was that a threat? Thomas? No, ma'am. I mean, he didn't say it like that exactly. Double quotes. The young man tugged at his collar. Thank you for bringing the message, Eli cut in, his voice gentle but firm. Best head back now, before the snow gets deeper. They watched from the doorway as Thomas mounted up and rode away, his horse's hoofbeats muffled by the snow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the white ground, and Clara shivered, though not entirely from the cold. You don't have to refuse. On my account, Eli said quietly, closing the door. That's good money they're offering. Clara turned to face him. I'm not refusing for you. I'm refusing because that spring was my father's legacy. Because water rights mean life out here, like you said. And because I don't cotton to being pressured into selling what's rightfully mine. A ghost of a smile crossed Eli's face. Your father raised you strong, Clara May. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and the leftover biscuits, Clara sat mending one of Eli's shirts by the fire. The familiar motion of needle and thread helped calm her mind, though questions about the telegram's implied threat kept. Circling like coyotes in the dark, through the cabin's thick walls came the lonely cry of a night bird. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. In his spot near the hearth, Eli knelt quietly, head bowed in prayer. His lips moved silently, but Clara caught fragments about wisdom and protection. Later, lying in bed listening to Eli's deep, steady breathing from his bedroll, Clara felt an odd mix of emotions. Fear of what the railroad agent might do, uncertainty about her future, but also, surprise in herself, a growing sense of alliance with the giant cowboy who'd bought her for $1. Whatever came next, she realized, they would face it together. Moon cast silver light through the window, painting patterns on the cabin wall. Clara watched them shift and change until her eyes grew heavy, though sleep remained elusive. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs heavy with snow, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. 2 days after the telegram arrived, frost painted delicate patterns on the cabin windows. Clara wrapped her worn shawl tighter as she watched Eli hitch the horses to the wagon. His breath clouded in the crisp morning air while he checked each trace and buckle with careful attention. Town's a good 3 hours with these roads, he said, helping Clara up onto the wagon seat. His large hand steadied her easily, treating her solid frame with natural respect. Might want that blanket across your lap. The wagon creaked as they set out, runners cutting fresh tracks in the snow. Tall pines lined the road, their branches heavy with white. The slow pace gave Clara time to study her companion's profile. The strong jaw, the scar that traced his cheek like a pale river. How'd you come by that mark? She asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Eli touched his cheek briefly. Got. It's serving with the Buffalo Soldiers, 10th Cavalry. I've heard tell of them, brave men. He nodded slowly. We did our duty proud most times. His voice grew quieter. Until they ordered us to clear Apache families off their traditional lands. Women, children, elders didn't matter to the commanders. Said they were in the way of progress. Clara's heart squeezed. What did you do? Couldn't do it, wouldn't. His hands tightened on the reins. Resigned my sergeant's stripes that same day. Some folks called me traitor. Others understood, especially those who knew what it meant to be pushed off their own land. The horses plodded on through the snow as Clara absorbed this. It explained something about him, the gentle strength, the quiet way he stood against. Wrong. By midday, they reached town. Main Street looked different from the morning of the auction, less crowded, but every face they passed seemed to hold an opinion about them. Mrs. Henderson from the church waved warmly. Old Jim Tucker tipped his hat to Eli with clear respect. But others whispered behind gloved hands, eyes following the giant's wife with unconcealed curiosity. At the mercantile, Clara focused on her shopping list while Eli loaded sacks of flour and coffee into the wagon. She was examining fabric when movement caught her eye. Two well-dressed men by the store window, watching her with calculating expressions. Their clean suits and city boots marked them as railroad men. Found what you need? Eli's deep voice behind her made her start. Yes, I reckon so. She kept her voice steady, but Eli must have noticed her tension. His eyes swept the store, noting the railroad men who suddenly became very interested in examining tools. They finished their shopping efficiently after that. The winter sun was already dropping toward the horizon when they stopped at the creek. To water the horses, ice rimmed the banks in thick sheets. Need to break through for the horses, Eli said, reaching for the axe behind the seat. The blade flashed as he swung, breaking a hole large enough for the team to drink. The crack of splitting ice echoed through the stillness. Clara stood stretching her legs while the horses drank, admiring how the sunset painted the snow in shades of rose and gold. The beauty of it almost made her forget the railroad men's watching eyes. Back at the cabin, they unloaded supplies by lantern light. Eli reached under the wagon seat for a forgotten package and froze. His hand emerged holding a folded paper. "Clara May," he said softly, "come see this." She moved closer, taking the note with trembling fingers. The message was short but clear. "Sell the spring. Last warning." The paper shook in her hands. Eli gently took it, strode to the fireplace, and set it among the flames. They watched it curl and blacken through their simple supper of salt pork and potatoes. Eli's jaw stayed clenched tight. He spoke little, but his eyes kept straying to the windows, as if watching for shadows in the dark. Clara felt the weight of unspoken worry settle over them, both like a heavy blanket. The fire crackled in the hearth, its light catching the fine lines of tension around Eli's eyes. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the lonely sound of winter across the snow. They both knew trouble was coming, as surely as spring would follow the thaw. A blanket of white settled over the countryside as winter tightened its grip. For 7 days straight, snow fell in thick curtains, transforming the landscape into a pristine wilderness. The cabin became their whole world, warm and close against the howling wind outside. Clara found comfort in the familiar rhythms of domestic life. Her needle flashed in the firelight as she worked through their pile of worn clothing. Eli's shirts needed particular attention. His broad shoulders strained every seam. She hummed softly while working old hymns her mother had taught her. "Much obliged for the mending," Eli said one morning, running his thumb over a newly patched elbow. "Been meaning to fix these for months." Clara smiled, pleased. "It's good to feel useful again." She sorted through her sewing supplies, currently scattered across the small table, though I could use a proper place to keep everything organized. That afternoon, Eli cleared space in the corner and began working with wood scraps he'd saved. His huge hands looked almost comical holding the delicate carpenter's tools, but his movements were precise and careful. By supper time, he'd crafted a set of neat shelves, each one perfectly sized for Clara's sewing basket and supplies. "It's beautiful," she said, running her hand along the smooth pine. "You've got quite a gift with woodworking." Eli ducked his head at the praise. "Just something I picked up along the way. Reckoned you deserved the space of your own." Clara tried new recipes to pass the time, working from memory to recreate dishes her grandmother had taught her. Some experiments turned out better than others, but Eli ate everything with appreciation. His genuine enjoyment of her cooking made her want to try harder, to master the temperamental wood stove that seemed to have a mind of its own. On the 7th day, the snow finally stopped. Weak winter sunlight filtered through the clouds, making the fresh powder sparkle like diamond dust. Clara sat by the window with her mending, enjoying the peaceful view. A flash of movement caught her eye, a dark shape among the trees. She squinted, then felt her breath catch. A man on horseback stood at the edge of the forest, watching the cabin. Even at this distance, his posture spoke of ill intent. "Eli," she called softly, not taking her eyes from the figure. "Someone's out there." He moved to the window, his expression hardening as he spotted the rider. Without a word, he retrieved his rifle from its place above the door and stepped outside. The stranger wheeled his horse around at Eli's appearance and melted back into the trees like a shadow. Clara's hands trembled as she set down her sewing. When Eli came back inside, his face was grim. "I recognized him," he said, carefully cleaning snow from his boots. "Works for Barrett over at the Double B Ranch. He's in deep with the railroad men." They sat close to the fire that evening, the warmth doing little to chase away their unease. Clara broke the heavy silence first. "We could ride to the sheriff," she suggested, though her tone held little hope. Eli shook his head. "Sheriff's pocket's been lined with railroad money for years, and the territorial court's a 2-week ride in good weather." He stoked the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "With these snows, we'd never make it before spring." Clara wrapped her shawl tighter, thinking hard. They needed allies, needed the town to see them as people worth standing beside, not just subjects of gossip. An idea began to form. "Christmas is coming," she said slowly. "The whole town will be at church for services." Eli looked up, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You want to go? We should. Together." Clara sat straighter, conviction growing. "Let them see us as neighbors, not threats. Some folks already respect you from your cavalry days. Others knew my father as an honest man." She reached across the table, surprised by her own boldness as she touched Eli's weathered hand. "We're stronger facing them as one than hiding out here alone." Eli was quiet for a long moment, studying their joined hands. Finally he nodded. "You're right. Won't be easy, though. Some folks aren't kind to those who stand in progress's way." "Then we'll face their unkindness with dignity," Clara said firmly. "I won't let fear keep me from God's house on Christmas." A ghost of a smile touched Eli's lips. "You're a brave woman, Clara May Patterson." She felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. "And you're a good man, Eli Cartwright." Time folks remembered that. The fire crackled between them as they planned their Christmas attendance. Outside, stars began to peek through breaking clouds, their light reflecting off the endless white. The watcher in the woods was gone, but his presence had changed something. Instead of frightening them into silence, it had pushed them to take a stand. Christmas Eve arrived with a crystal clarity that only the deepest winter could bring. The morning sun blazed across endless white drifts, turning every ice crystal into a prism. The temperature had plummeted overnight, leaving frost patterns like delicate lace across the cabin's small windows. Clara stood before the cracked mirror, adjusting her best black dress and the new wool shawl Eli had given her yesterday. He'd presented it awkwardly, explaining he'd traded some timber work for it at the mercantile weeks ago. The deep blue fabric brought out warmth in her complexion she hadn't noticed before. "Ready?" Eli asked from the doorway. He wore his good coat, carefully brushed free of dust, and had trimmed his beard. The sight of him making an effort touched something in Clara's heart. "As I'll ever be," she replied, squaring her shoulders. Eli had risen before dawn to warm the wagon with heated stones wrapped in burlap. Now he helped Clara up onto the seat, his large hands steady and sure. The leather reins creaked in the brittle air as he clucked to the horses, their breath frosted in white clouds as they drove toward town. The road wound between frozen cottonwoods, their bare branches encased in ice that sparkled like glass in the morning light. Snowbanks rose shoulder-high on either side, carved into waves by the winter wind. The horses' hooves crunched rhythmically through the packed snow. "Beautiful morning," Clara said, breaking their comfortable silence. "Reminds me of Christmas when I was small. Papa would always say the cold made the stars shine brighter." Eli nodded. "Your father was right about many things." He paused, then added quietly, "He was kind to me once when others weren't. Never forgot that." They reached the outskirts of Silverton just as the church bell began to toll. The small white building sat proud against the blue sky, smoke curling from its chimney. Already, other wagons and riders were arriving, families. In their Sunday best hurrying inside. As Eli helped Clara down from the wagon, the first whispers started. She heard her name, saw heads turning. But she kept her chin high, remembering her father's words about dignity being something no one could take unless you gave it away. The Reverend Josiah Whitley stood at the church door, his breath visible in the cold as he greeted his flock. His weathered face broke into a genuine smile when he saw them. "Eli Cartwright," he called warmly, extending his hand. "Still blessed by that fine roof work you did for us last spring. Not a single leak, even with all this snow." Elila's handshake was firm. "Glad to hear it, Reverend." "And Miss Clara," Reverend Whitley continued, taking her gloved hand in both of his, "welcome home. The choir's been missing your voice these past months." Clara blinked back sudden tears. "Thank you, Reverend. It's good to be here." Inside, the church glowed with lamplight and pine boughs. The pot-bellied stove radiated welcome heat. More whispers followed them down the aisle, but Clara noticed they weren't all unkind. Mrs. Henderson, who'd known her mother, offered a small wave. Old Mr. Roberts, who'd served with Eli in the cavalry, touched his hat respectfully. The women's choir gathered at the front, and Clara took her usual place among the sopranos. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her hymnal, but when they began Silent Night, her voice rose clear and true. She felt Eli's eyes on her from his pew, steady as a mountain. Reverend Whitley's sermon spoke of hope in dark times, of how the Christmas story showed light could come from the humblest beginnings. Clara felt the words settle into her soul like warm honey, easing some of the tension she'd carried since the auction. After the service, the congregation gathered in the churchyard where tables had been set up despite the cold. Steam rose from cups of hot cider, and platters of gingerbread and sugar cookies circulated. Clara accepted a cup, warming her hands around it. To her surprise, several townspeople approached them. Mrs. Thompson, the banker's wife, touched her arm. "That shawl becomes you lovely, dear. And your voice hasn't lost its sweetness." Even more surprising was when Tom Fletcher, who'd laughed loudest at the auction, shuffled up to Eli. "Been meaning to say that business at the auction weren't right. My May would have tanned my hide if she'd heard me carrying on so." He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Eli's large hand found the small of her back, lending silent support. The winter sun was setting by the time they started home, painting the snow in shades of rose and gold. Stars were already appearing in the eastern sky, brilliant in the crystal clear air. Clara sat closer to Eli than she had on the journey in, grateful for his warmth and solid presence. "Thank you," she said softly, "for suggesting we come today." "Was your idea," he reminded her, adjusting the blanket over their laps. "Still, having you beside me made it easier." She watched their horses' ears flicking back and forth. "Maybe some folks aren't as set against us as we feared." "Maybe not," Eli agreed. "Reverend Whitley's a good man. His welcome carries weight." They rode on in comfortable silence as the stars multiplied overhead. Clara felt something delicate taking root in her heart, not quite peace, but perhaps its beginning. One church service wouldn't solve all their troubles, but it had shown her they weren't alone. The cabin windows glowed with welcome when they finally arrived home, Eli having banked the fire carefully before they left. As he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary. Clara found she didn't mind at all. at all. Christmas morning dawned peaceful and bright in the line shack. The scent of fresh cinnamon rolls and strong coffee filled the small space, making it feel more like home than it ever had. Clara had risen before sunrise to prepare the special breakfast, humming carols softly as she worked at the wood stove. Eli emerged from his bedroll on the floor, his usual quiet manner softened by the holiday spirit. "Smells like heaven itself in here," he said, accepting a steaming cup of coffee. From Clara's hands, they sat at the small table, sharing warm rolls and comfortable silence. Morning sunlight streamed through the frost-covered windows, making rainbow patterns on the wooden floor. Clara couldn't help but notice how different this Christmas felt from last year's lonely vigil in her empty house in town. "I have something for you," Clara said, reaching for a wrapped package beside her chair. Her cheeks colored slightly as she handed it to Eli. "It's not much, just something I made from leftover yarn." Eli's large hands carefully unwrapped the simple brown paper. Inside lay a thick wool scarf in deep forest green, carefully knitted in a complex pattern. He ran his fingers over the stitches, wonder clear in his expression. "No one's made me anything in, well, longer than I can remember," he said softly. "Thank you, Clara." He stood and walked to the locked chest, retrieving something from inside. "I have something for you too." He presented her with a wooden box, about the size of a bread loaf, beautifully carved with a pattern of wild roses around the edges. Clara gasped softly as she traced the delicate designs. "When did you make this?" "Been working on it nights." "After you'd gone to sleep," Eli admitted. "Thought you might need somewhere special for your keepsakes." Their eyes met across the table, and something warm and tender passed between them. The moment was broken when Eli glanced at the wood box by the stove. "Running low on fuel," he said, rising. "I'll fetch some more from the stack." Clara nodded, already planning where to place her new treasure. She was arranging the remaining cinnamon rolls on a plate when Eli burst back through the door. His face had gone ash white, and his hands were shaking. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, "come with me, now." She followed him outside, clutching her shawl against the morning cold. The sight that greeted her stopped her heart. Where the storage shack had stood was now a heap of blackened timbers, still smoking faintly in the crystal air. The barn doors hung open, its contents scattered and broken. The cattle pen stood empty, tracks in the snow showing where the animals had been driven off. Eli's hand gripped her elbow as they approached the ruins. The heat of the fire had melted the surrounding snow into a sheet of ice, making their steps treacherous. The acrid smell of burned wood and rope stung Clara's nose. "Over here," Eli said grimly, leading her to a tall pine tree at the edge of the clearing. A piece of paper had been nailed to the trunk at eye level. Clara's hands trembled as she read the crude message. "Sell the spring or bury your giant." "Oh God," she whispered, clutching Eli's arm. His muscles were rigid under her fingers. "They really mean to kill you." "Let's salvage what we can," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "We need to get to town before dark." They worked quickly, gathering what little had survived in the cabin. Clara's new wooden box went into the wagon, along with the chest containing their marriage certificate. She found her blue shawl miraculously unharmed, though it smelled of smoke. A few cooking pots, some blankets, and Eli's rifle completed their meager belongings. The horses stomped nervously as Eli hitched them to the wagon, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Clara stood watching the ruins of their temporary home, feeling the cold seep into her bones despite the heavy shawl. "Who would do this on Christmas Day?" she asked softly. "Someone who wants us to know they don't fear God or man," Eli answered, helping her up onto the wagon seat. He tucked the blankets around her with careful hands before climbing up himself. As they turned toward town, Clara looked back one last time. The smoking ruins seemed to mock the peaceful Christmas morning, a stark reminder that their troubles were far from over. The new scarf around Eli's neck and the carved box in the wagon were precious symbols of what they'd briefly found here, and what someone was determined to destroy. The wagon creaked through the snow as they headed for Silverton, and the sanctuary of the church, leaving behind the ashes of their Christmas peace. Clara's hand found Eli's under the blanket, and his fingers tightened around hers, offering what comfort he could as they faced an uncertain road ahead. Reverend Whitley's boots echoed on the wooden floor as he led Clara and Eli through the quiet church. The Sunday school room was small but tidy, with colorful Bible verses adorning the walls and small chairs stacked in the corner. "It ain't much," the Reverend said, laying out thick quilts on the floor, "but you'll be safe here. The Lord's house turns no one away." His weathered hands smoothed the blankets with practiced care. Clara set her salvaged belongings against the wall while Eli brought in more firewood for the pot-bellied stove. The familiar scent of pine smoke and beeswax candles filled the air, bringing a measure of comfort after the day's horrors. As night settled over Silverton, snow began tapping against the windows like tiny fingers. The sound reminded Clara of lonely nights in her empty house after her husband died. But now, watching Eli's broad shoulders as he tended the fire, different fears gripped her heart. "I can't bear the thought of them hurting you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not over a spring I've never even seen." Eli turned from the stove, his face half-shadowed. He settled onto the quilts beside her, his large frame making the floorboards creak. "Got something I need to tell you, Clara, about why I left the army." Clara waited, watching his hands clench and unclench in his lap. "It was during the Apache campaigns," he began, his deep voice rough with memory. "We had orders to clear a valley. Women and children were there, trying to gather their winter stores. Commander wanted us to fire on them, drive them out." He paused, swallowing hard. "I couldn't do it, wouldn't do it." The stove popped and crackled in the silence. "They branded me a coward," Eli continued. "Stripped my sergeant's stripes, discharged me without honor. Some nights I still hear those children crying." Clara reached out, laying her hand over his clenched fist. "That wasn't cowardice, Eli Cartwright. That was courage of the truest kind." He looked at her then, surprise and something deeper flickering in his eyes. "A coward follows orders he knows are wrong," she said firmly. "A brave man stands against them, no matter the cost. I see nothing but courage when I look at you." Eli's fingers slowly uncurled beneath hers, rough palm turning up to clasp her hand. They sat that way for a long while, listening to the snow against the glass and the settling of the old church around them. Morning brought a flurry of activity. Reverend Whitley sent his youngest son running to fetch the sheriff, while his wife Sarah brought fresh bread and coffee from the parsonage kitchen. Sheriff Mills arrived before noon, his star glinting dully in the winter light. He listened to their account of the burning and threats, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. "Wish I could do more," he said finally, thumbing the brim of his hat. "But without witnesses or proof of who did it, my hands are tied by the law." He looked apologetically at Clara. "Best I can do is keep an extra eye on things." After he left, Eli walked down to the livery stable, where the owner had offered him work repairing tack. Clara watched him go, noting how he's scanning the street. Before rounding each corner, she spent the afternoon in the church kitchen with Sarah Whitley, peeling potatoes for the evening meal. The repetitive work was soothing, and Sarah's quiet presence offered comfort without demands for conversation. "The Lord tests our mettle in the fire," Sarah said at last, her knife moving steadily through the potatoes. "But He never gives us more than we can bear with His help." Clara nodded, thinking of the smoking ruins of the storage shack, of the threat against Eli's life. "Sometimes the bearing is mighty hard," she admitted. "That's why He gives us each other," Sarah replied simply. As evening approached, Eli returned smelling of leather and saddle soap. His big hands were raw from working with the tools, but there was satisfaction in his face at having earned their keep. They ate a simple supper of potato soup and bread. in the Sunday school room, sharing quiet conversation about the day's events. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters against the church walls. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Storm's coming," Eli observed. Banking the fire for the night. Clara settled onto her quilts, watching shadows dance on the walls. The shutters clattered again, and she thought of their burned-out shelter in the woods. Here, at least, they were safe and warm, if uncertain of what tomorrow might bring. Eli lay down on his own bedding across the room, respecting her privacy as he had in the line shack. "Sleep well, Clara," he said softly. "You too, Eli," she replied. Pulling the quilts up to her chin, the wind continued its assault on the shutters as they drifted off to sleep, but Clara found she didn't mind the sound so much anymore. Whatever storms were coming, they would face them together. Dawn broke pale and cold over Silverton's snow-covered streets. Eli stood at the church window, watching the first light paint the drifts in shades of pearl and rose. His breath frosted the glass as he studied the quiet town, looking for any sign of threat. Clara joined him, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You've got that look," she said, passing him one of the cups. "Like you're fixing to do something." "Reckon it's time we faced this head-on," Eli replied, his deep voice steady. "Can't hide in the church forever. Those railroad men won't stop until they get an answer." Clara sipped her coffee, considering. "Where do you mean to go?" "First to the Apache agency," he said. "Got friends there might help. Then to Reynolds Ranch, that's where those railroad fellows have been staying." The church creaked around them as the morning warmed. Clara set down her cup with quiet determination. "I'm coming with you." Eli started to protest, but she held up her hand. "It's my spring thereafter, my fight too." Within the hour, they were in the wagon, bundled against the cold. The horses' hooves crunched through crusty snow as they left town, following the winding road through stands of snow-laden pines. Their breath clouded in the crisp air while the wagon wheels squeaked against the frozen ground. The sun climbed higher as they traveled, but offered little warmth. Clara huddled closer to Eli's solid presence, grateful for the shared heat. They spoke little, each lost in thought about what lay ahead. 2 hours into their journey, Eli turned the wagon onto a narrower track leading to the Apache agency. The agency buildings came into view, a collection of weathered wooden structures flying both the American flag and the agency's own banner. Several Apache men were already outside, splitting wood and tending to horses. They straightened as the wagon approached, faces brightening with recognition. "Brother," one called out in English, striding forward. "It has been too long." Eli climbed down, helping Clara from the wagon. "Good to see you, Joseph," he said, clasping the man's hand. "Is Nate here?" Joseph nodded, gesturing toward the main building. "Inside. He will be glad to see you." They followed Joseph into the agency house, stomping snow from their boots. The interior was warm and surprisingly bright, with windows letting in the winter sun. A tall, dignified man rose from behind a desk covered in papers and books. "Eli." "Cartwright," Naisha said, his voice rich with welcome. "The years have been kind to you." His eyes moved to Clara, questioning. "This is Clara May Patterson," Eli said. "My double quotes," he hesitated slightly, "my wife." Nate inclined his head respectfully. "Welcome to both of you. Please sit. Share our morning meal." A woman brought bowls of venison stew, steam rising fragrant in the warm room. As they ate, Eli explained their situation, the threats, the burning of the line shack. Clara watched Atisa's face grow serious as Eli spoke. "Show me this marriage certificate," Naish said when Eli finished. Eli retrieved the document from his coat. Naish studied it carefully, his fingers tracing the signatures. "And this spring they seek, where does it lie?" Eli described the location. Naish's expression sharpened with interest. "Ah," he said, "I know this place well." He rose, moving to a wall where maps hung in neat rows. His finger found a spot with practiced ease. This spring lies within lands never legally ceded by our people. The Treaty of 1873 specifically excludes this watershed. Clara leaned forward. What does that mean for us? It means, Nietzsche said, that under law, these waters still belong to the Apache Nation. Neither the railroad nor the ranchers can claim them without our consent. He smiled slightly. And we do not consent. Eli's shoulders straightened. You'll help us? I will do more than help, Nietzsche said. I will tell you a story first of a winter 5 years past when our children were hungry and the agency supplies had not arrived. He looked at Clara. Your husband was still a sergeant then. Against orders, he brought us food, meat, flour, blankets. He risked much. Clara's eyes went to Eli, who studied his empty bowl intently. We do not forget such debts, Nietzsche continued. But we must act quickly. When spring thaw comes, the railroad will bring their crews. They care little for paper rights once their rails are laid. He returned to his desk, pulling out fresh paper. I will write letters to the Indian agent, to the territorial governor, to the army commander. All will affirm our claim to the spring. He began writing in a firm hand. But more importantly, I will send men to watch the spring and your lands. None will dare move against you with Apache warriors as witnesses. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected alliance. We're much obliged, she said softly. Nietzsche looked up, his gaze direct. It is justice, nothing more. The strong should not steal from the weak. This is true for all peoples. They shared more stew, as Nietzsche wrote, the room quiet except for the scratch of his pen and the crack of logs in the fireplace. When he finished, he sealed the letters carefully. These will go out today, he said. Now you must face the ranchers, knowing you do not stand alone. They said their goodbyes, Clara noting how the Apache men clasped Eli's arm with genuine warmth. Back in the wagon, heading toward the ranch headquarters, she studied his profile. You never told me about bringing food to them that winter, she said. Eli clicked to the horses, eyes on the snowy road. Wasn't nothing that needed telling, just did what was right. Clara reached over and squeezed his arm, saying nothing more. The wagon rolled on through the pine forest, the horses' steady pace carrying them toward their confrontation with the ranchers. But now, with Nietzsche's support and the weight of treaty law behind them, the task seemed less daunting. The winter sun climbed higher as they traveled, its pale light filtering through the snow-laden branches. Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in a long while: hope. As steady and warming as the sunlight on her face, the winter sun hung low in the western sky, as steady as warming as the sunlight on her face. Eli guided the wagon up the long drive to Silas Brandt's ranch house. The sprawling, two-story building dominated the snow-covered landscape, its windows gleaming like cold eyes in the fading light. Smoke curled from 3 brick chimneys, and lamplight already glowed behind heavy curtains. Clara's fingers tightened on the leather satchel containing Nietzsche's documents. Quite the palace he's built himself, she murmured. Built on other folks. Broken dreams, Eli replied, his deep voice tight with controlled anger. 2 armed ranch hands emerged from the barn as the wagon approached, rifles held casually but visible. They flanked the main door, where Silas Brandt himself appeared, a tall figure in an expensive Eastern suit. His silver hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and his thin smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, well, Brandt called out as Eli helped Clara down from the wagon. If it isn't the giant and his auction block bride, to what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Clara felt Eli stiffen beside her at the insult, but his voice remained steady. Reckon you know why we're here, Mr. Brandt. Time to talk about the spring. Of course, of course. Brandt gestured expansively toward the door. Please, come in from the cold. Though I must say, you're wasting your time. My offer was more than generous. They followed him into a front parlor warm with firelight. Rich carpets covered the floor, and leather-bound books lined dark wooden shelves. The two ranch hands took up positions by the door, their presence a silent threat. "Drink?" Brant offered, moving to a crystal decanter. Neither Clara nor Eli responded. "No? Well then." Brant poured himself a measure of amber liquid. "Let's discuss business. I'm prepared to raise my offer for the water rights. Say $500? That's a fortune for folks in your situation." Eli stepped forward, his massive frame making the elegant room feel suddenly smaller. "We're not here to sell, mister Brant. We're here to tell you the spring isn't yours to buy." "Oh." Brant's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. "And why is that?" With deliberate care, Allie withdrew Nature's documents from the satchel. "Because that spring lies on land still held by treaty with the Apache Nation. Taking it without their consent would be theft under United States law." Brant's face darkened as he scanned the papers. "These supposed treaties?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You expect me to believe a bunch of savages have any real claim? No court in the territory would side with them or with nobodies like you two." The word nobodies struck Clara like a physical blow, igniting something deep inside her. Before she realized what she was doing, she stepped past Eli, facing Brant directly. "Then you won't mind if we present these documents to the territorial judge," she said, her voice clear and strong in the firelit room. "I'm sure he'd be interested to know about the burned shack, the stolen cattle, and the death threats too." Brant's smirk faltered for just a moment. "Are you threatening me, Mrs. Patterson?" "No, Mr. Brant. I'm promising you that I will fight for what's rightfully mine. And I won't be fighting alone." Clara lifted her chin. "The Apache will stand with us. Their warriors are watching the spring even now. How do you think that will look to a judge, you trying to steal land from both settlers and natives?" The ranch hands shifted uncomfortably by the door. Brant's knuckles whitened around his glass. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. "The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Progress can't be stopped by one stubborn woman and her pet giant." "Maybe not," Clara replied. "But we can make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of progress it is, the kind that burns homes and threatens honest folks. How will your Eastern investors feel about that?" Eli's hand touched her shoulder, gentle but firm. "We've said our piece," he rumbled. "Good evening, Mr. Brant." They turned to go, Clara's heart pounding but her step steady. Behind them, Brant's voice carried a sharp edge of warning. "You're choosing a hard road, Mrs. Patterson. There are worse things than losing a spring." Clara paused in the doorway, but didn't turn around. "There are indeed, Mr. Brant. Losing one's soul, for instance." "Good evening." Outside, the temperature had dropped further, and stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Eli helped Clara into the wagon without a word, but his hands lingered supportively on her waist. As they drove away from the ranch house, Clara finally allowed herself to tremble. "Lord above," she whispered, "I can't believe I said all that." "You did fine," Eli said quietly. "Better than fine. You showed him what you're made of." "I was terrified the whole time. Being brave isn't about not being scared," Eli replied. "It's about doing what's right, even when you are scared." Clara huddled closer to his solid warmth as the wagon rolled through the gathering dark. Behind them, lamplight still gleamed in Brant's windows, but it no longer seemed so threatening. They had drawn their line in the snow, and though the fight was far from over, they would face it together. Gray shadows cloaked the frozen landscape as Eli and Clara hitched the horses before first light. Their breath formed white clouds in the bitter air while they loaded supplies into the wagon. Clara tucked extra blankets around a basket of cornbread and dried meat she had prepared for the journey. Nate and two other Apache elders arrived on horseback just as the eastern sky began to pale. Their mounts' hooves crunched softly in the crusted snow. Among them was Natch's wife, Obese, her dark eyes kind as she nodded to Clara. "The road to Fort Davis will be long," Nash said, his voice carrying quiet authority. "We should move while the snow is still firm." Eli helped Clara up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. The small convoy set out as dawn broke over the white-dusted hills, their shadows stretching long across untouched snow. The Apache riders moved with fluid grace, their horses picking careful paths alongside the wagon. Throughout the morning, they wound through pine-covered slopes and across open meadows. By midday, when they stopped to rest the horses, Obese approached Clara with a wrapped bundle. "Share our meal," she said, offering Clara fresh flatbread. "The journey is easier with friendship." As they ate, the two women began to talk. Obese spoke of losing her first husband in a cavalry raid, of rebuilding life with Nash, of teaching her daughters to be strong. Clara found herself sharing her own story of widowhood and shame, of the auction block and finding unexpected allies. "The land remembers those who protect it," Obese said softly, "like the spring remembers the rain." They reached the way station as evening settled in, a rough-hewn building with gaps between its log walls. Inside, a small potbelly stove cast more shadows than warmth. The group huddled close, sharing food and stories while wind whistled through the cracks. "Tell me of the Buffalo Soldiers," one of the elders asked Eli. "You served with honor?" "I served with conscience," Eli replied quietly. "Sometimes that's not the same thing." The night passed slowly, but dawn found them on the road again. By late afternoon, the county seat of Fort Davis came into view, its courthouse rising above weathered buildings like a stern patriarch. Judge Harrison Pritchard received them in his chambers, a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He studied the treaty documents with careful attention, his fingers tracing the official seals. "These are serious matters," he said finally, looking up at the unusual group before him. "Water rights, proxy marriage, treaty violations, allegations of threats and arson." He removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly. "I will need time to review everything properly. 1 week. Stay in town until then. There's safety in numbers, and I suspect you'll need it." Outside the courthouse, Nash clasped Eli's arm. "We return to watch the spring," he said. "Our young men will guard it well." Clara found herself embracing Obese, this woman who had become a friend in just 2 days. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The Apache riders departed as dusk approached, leaving Eli and Clara to find lodging above the mercantile. The room was small, its walls thin against the winter wind, but after nights on the church floor, it felt almost luxurious. Clara sat on the narrow bed, running her fingers over the quilt. "You think the judge will rule in our favor?" "He's a fair man," Eli said, stoking the small fire in the room's tiny stove. "That's all we can ask for." Outside their window, lamps were being lit along the street, their glow soft against the gathering dark. Clara watched them flicker, thinking of all the paths that had led to this moment, paths of loss and hope, weaving together like the threads of the quilt beneath her hands. All week long, Fort Davis hummed with speculation about the upcoming ruling. Clara noticed how conversations would halt when she passed by the general store, only to resume in hushed tones when she moved along. Ladies who had never spoken to her before now stopped to share encouraging words, while others crossed the street. To avoid her entirely, Eli caught snippets of talk at the livery stable where he helped repair wagons to earn their board. "Railroad means progress," some insisted. Others muttered about broken treaties and stolen land. The divide in town grew sharper with each passing day. On the morning of the ruling, frost coated the courthouse windows in delicate patterns. Clara smoothed her best dress, freshly pressed though still worn at the cuffs, and pinned her hair neatly. Eli wore his cleaned and mended coat, The scarf she had knitted him wrapped against the cold. They arrived early, but already a crowd filled the courthouse. Ranchers in heavy coats stood along one wall, railroad men in suits along another. Nate and several tribal elders sat with quiet dignity in the front row. Clara felt the weight of every stare as she and Eli took their seats beside them. Judge Pritchard entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. The room fell silent as he settled behind his desk, arranging papers with careful precision. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice carrying to every corner. This court has reviewed extensive documentation regarding water rights. To the spring in question, he said, the evidence is clear. The spring lies within land protected under the Treaty of 1872. The Apache Nation's claim is valid and legally binding. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The judge raised his hand for silence. Furthermore, the written transfer of stewardship from the Apache Nation to Mrs. Clara May Patterson Cartwright is properly executed and witnessed. This court recognizes her legal right to manage these waters in accordance with tribal interests. Cheers erupted from one side of the room. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes as Nature's wife squeezed her hand. Eli's large palm came to rest protectively on her shoulder. Order. Judge Pritchard's gavel cracked against wood. This ruling is final and will be enforced by territorial law. Silas Brant shot to his feet, his face mottled red with fury. This is an outrage. He shouted. You cannot give American progress over to savages and their pet widow. You are out of order, Mr. Brant, the judge warned. But Brant was already storming toward the door, his boots thundering on wooden floors. This isn't over, he snarled, as he passed Clara, not by a long sight. That evening, as the sun set behind snow-covered hills, Clara and Eli joined Nature's family in their winter camp just outside town. The aroma of roasting venison filled the air, mixing with the sweet scent of fry bread cooking over hot coals. Coffee bubbled in a blackened pot, strong enough to make a man's eyes water. They gathered around the fire, passing plates and sharing quiet words of victory. Obese taught Clara the proper way to drizzle honey over the steaming fry bread. The children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the evening air. When snow melts, Nash said, we will help build your new home. Near the spring, where you can watch over the water. We would be honored, Eli replied, his deep voice gentle in the gathering dusk. Clara looked around the circle of faces warmed by firelight, her unlikely family, brought together by struggle and justice. The spring would flow free, protected by ancient rights and modern law. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the fire's glow, she knew trouble still waited. But for now there was bread and meat, coffee and companionship, and the promise of a home to come. The sweet scent of spring filled the air as winter's grip finally loosened its hold on the land. Melting snow turned the roads into ribbons of mud, but tender green shoots pushed through the dark earth and meadows everywhere, promising new beginnings. Clara stood at the edge of their chosen building site, watching as Eli drove the first stake into the ground. The morning sun caught the simple gold band on her finger, a proper wedding ring now, blessed by Reverend Whitley just last week in a small ceremony that had packed the church with well-wishers. Reckon this corner post'll do just fine, Eli sighed, his deep voice carrying across the clearing. He straightened to his full height, towering above the other men who had come to help. The same folks who had once jeered at Clara now arrived with shovels and saws, ready to raise walls and set beams. Wagon wheels creaked as more townspeople pulled up, bringing food and supplies. Women climbed down carrying covered dishes and seed, packets for planting. Children spilled out into the spring sunshine, their laughter echoing across the meadow as they chased each other through patches of wildflowers. Clara May, called Mrs. Henderson, who had once turned away from her in the mercantile. I brought my famous apple pie. And these tomato seedlings need a good home in your kitchen garden. Clara accepted both with a warm smile, remembering Eli's words about forgiveness making room for change. Together with the other women, she marked out plots for vegetables and herbs. Their hands worked the soil while they shared gardening wisdom passed down through generations. Near the house site, Eli and Nate positioned the first major beam together. Their strength matched as they lifted the heavy timber, setting it precisely where it needed to go. Clara watched their hands meet in a firm grip afterward, the former Buffalo soldier and the Apache leader, their respect for each other evident in every gesture. "Good medicine in this land," Nate said, nodding toward the spring that bubbled clear and strong nearby. "Good people to watch over it now." Throughout the day, the framework of their home took shape against the blue sky. Men called measurements and warnings as boards were lifted into place. Women arranged stones for a path to the spring. Children helped carry smaller tools and fetch water, proud to be part of the building. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Clara climbed carefully onto the newly laid porch boards. From there, she could see across her land, their land. The fresh-turned earth of the garden promised summer vegetables. The spring caught the late light like scattered diamonds. And everywhere she looked, people worked together, sharing stories and laughter. The sound of church bells floated across the distance from town, calling the faithful to evening prayers. Clara watched Eli directing the last tasks of the day, his massive frame gentle with the children who still darted around the workers' feet. Her heart swelled with love for this quiet giant who had saved her with a single silver dollar and then helped her save herself. A smile touched her lips as she remembered that cold auction day. $1, such a small price that had bought her not just freedom from shame, but a future filled with purpose, respect, and love. Through every trial, threats, fire, and fear, Eli had stood beside her. Now they would build their life together, supported by a community that had learned to see with clearer eyes and more open hearts. Mrs. Henderson called everyone to supper, laid out on makeshift tables near the spring. Clara saw Nature's wife showing town ladies the proper way to pat out fry bread, while their children played together in the lengthening shadows. The best bargain indeed, she thought, watching Eli make his way toward her with that gentle smile. That was hers alone. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.